Okay, cool. I think everybody has a seat and a drink. So welcome a second time to TechBase. I'm very excited. It's our second edition of Late Birds. This time a front-end topic. The right way to do micro front-ends. Two opinions. I'm Andy, CTO of 8Select, and I will try to guide you through the next 2 hours. So first of all, thank you to the team again, to the TechBase, our sponsors. We have a talk today, and maybe you have questions. We use Slido for that. It's an online tool, and to get online, you need Wi-Fi in the TechBase because the windows are kind of shielded. And to get Wi-Fi, you just can use Glasfaser Ostbayern. And to connect, you just select the Wi-Fi, and then you have to take care, because if you put in here 8Select, that's the username, you also have to remove the rest. Okay? Password is there on the small monitor. So, and to ask your questions, you just go to Slido, put in this ID, and then you can put in a question, and we will come back to that after the talk. So, everybody connected and online? Then let's welcome Matthias and Mario to the stage. Yay!
Thank you for having us.
Have fun.
Test. Thank you for having us. Before we start, there's one thing that I would want to do, and that's taking a selfie with me and Mario here. And the audience, of course. So if you don't want to be on a picture, please just do this so that your face will not be visible. And it's okay to make faces. And 3, 2, 1, cheese. Thank you very much. And with that and the computer almost set up.
Sorry, I was this long.
No worries. And with that, we would want to start this little presentation. First of all, welcome. Really great that all of you could make it here. At the moment, it's not really common that so many people show up on an event. Thank you very much for that. Still try to avoid too much contact to the other people, maybe. We're going to talk a little bit about microfrontends. And this is a topic that has become pretty prominent in the last few projects that we are working on. And this is why we want to share a little bit about what we have learned, why you should do microfrontends or why not, because actually not every single project might be fit to actually apply something like microfrontends. We also want to give you some ideas about how you can do microfrontends and what you can use to do that. We're both consultants. My name is Matthias. I'm in the tech industry for almost 20 years. I started in the year 2001. And I'm currently at ThoughtWorks as a tech lead and tech principal on different projects. I'm actually not coming from a front end. When you look at my history, I was actually pretty back-endy. But in the last few years, it turned out that more and more projects actually required front ends, and more projects went into the web. As we went into cross-functional teams, I kind of was forced to also look into weird languages like JavaScript or TypeScript, and had to cope with that. And I'm still trying to apply a few patterns that I've learned before.
Thanks. So I think it's important to note that even though we are consultants, we're still developing code. So I mean, our output is actually, code that we write together with our clients. So we don't do slides, except those. This is an exception. But in general, we are actually coding the things we are doing. So it's not just purely, fancy presentations. So micro frontends, right? I think before we even talk about micro frontends, we have to talk about microservices first. At this point, I assume that at least every second corporate project, you can see it in our clients, is doing microservices in one way or the other. So that seems like a thing that has won the day, right? Not everybody needs that, though. I mean, there are a lot of projects doing microservices that might not need microservices, which is something we have to live with. But anyhow, microservices are a topic that comes really from the backend side, right? A lot of us have started our careers as backend developers to some extent, and at some point we started our customers expect things to be displayed on a website at some point, so we need to take care of that as well. So what happened with the front end when we started with this microservices approach? What happened was something like this. So in many organizations, they went through the trouble of splitting up their stuff, their monolith in micro frontends through all the pain that comes with it. And maybe even they did proper domain boundaries. Maybe they even did domain event storming like Matthias loves to do. And they got a very nice separation of their backend code. But then the front end remained as a huge monolith that was being delivered as an entity. And then, well, all the problems that you have with a monolith, in terms of deploying it, in terms of delivering stuff to our customers, was there. So you could have things like this. Maybe it's a bit exaggerated, right? But it's not that far away from the truth. We do have some clients where change is hard to come to. And the idea that the front end is a big, monstrosity is there, and it's actually preventing them from actually delivering things to their customers that are doing something useful. That even make it to our tech radar. Not sure whether you're familiar, but there's the link on the bottom half. And we basically have it in November this year, pretty much what I said. Some people are using microservices. It's actually for a reason. They are getting some value out of it, but then they are hitting a wall. Even though they are moving fast, they are delivering this stuff quite fast, they are still doing this massive blob of front-end code that is super hard to change. And that there is a reaction against that, which is microfrontends, a way of handling this complexity and bringing those benefits. I haven't really said yet what is actually microfrontend. What do we understand under microfrontends? So let's get on with some definitions. We have it here, taken from microfrontends.com, perfect example. Architectural style, well, independently deliverable front-end applications are composed into a greater whole. So basically, what I would say, microservices for the front-end, which seems to be an easy thing to remember. And there are two perspectives here in terms of how does this look like what is actually what you can see with your own eyes. Let's start first with the developer's perspective, because we are selfish and we always think first in terms of our own experience and then in terms of the user, even though we claim to do the other way around. In terms of developers, what you have with microfrontends is you basically split this front end in multiple apps. You have multiple different applications, and you can treat them as separate entities that you can deploy separately. You have a delivery pipeline. That means that each of those is going to create an artifact. That's more or less the gist to it, right? But then, maybe you are wondering, well, fine, we are dividing our app into smaller front ends. That seems sensible. But we are not forcing the user to open 10 different tabs to get the app they want to check, right? So at the end, there is a step. The last step there is composing them into something in a way that is, made useful and can be actually utilized. So that's what we're going to get into in a minute. But let's get to the perspective of the user. How does this look like in terms of somebody consuming an application? be it an internal application, be it an application that is used by, like end customers, doesn't really matter. It actually should not have any visible impact. You should be able, to say, open your tab, get your stuff, but then if you check, like, different parts are going to be composed of different applications. You might be doing this to some extent already. I mean, microfrontend is not like it's not something that you say, all right, we have found here the magical thing that will allow software development to become better. So maybe you're doing a version of this, having these things separated in different things and not letting the user know too much. There is an article in that written by a colleague of us, appeared on Martin Fowler website. I would say Martin Fowler in these talks because ThoughtWorks is a lot less known than Martin Fowler. I've done this experiment a few times, and it tends to be ThoughtWorks, but Martin Fowler tends to be a name that people haven't heard of already. Nonetheless, if you really want to get into a lot of more detail, which we kind of capture in a couple of slides, I can only encourage you to have a look at this thing. So what? Again, microfrontends for the microservices for the front end, basically dividing things. The next important question is, why would you do that? Does it make any sense? What are you getting out of it? Because as we are going to get in a few slides, this is bringing a certain amount of complexity, so you have to be getting out something, some benefit out of it. So I guess the first one is incremental updates. What is that? For me, the example is, I mean, we as consultants work for usually very large German companies like automotive, retail, these kind of companies that are massive. And it's really common that they have some sort of application. It's a corporate application that was started back when Internet Explorer 6 was a hot thing. And they have these things going, and they are helpful for the users, but that thing is completely and utterly impossible to change. The idea of doing a new release of that is something that is maybe, I don't know, one client of mine named the release based on the number of the quarter. So you can imagine how often they actually manage to get their stuff out. So the idea of a microfrontend is that you can inject yourself into this. Like maybe you're not going to change the whole thing, but maybe you can start with a small little chunk where you inject something, you put there a little Trojan horse, so to speak, and you can start delivering that one more often. So you actually are doing something, even though the website might take years or decades to change. Independent deployments. This is basically what we would call the path to production, which is one of our favorite things to say. Like, we love to talk about the path to production. And basically, that's right, the idea of how long does it take from when a developer checks their code into the version control until it actually reaches the end customers. How long is that process? How much pain is in the middle? How many steps are in between? That's, for me, really important metric to measure the health of a project. And that means that if you have something that is hard to deploy, dividing it in 10 things won't fix it altogether, but it will make it easier because you are not deploying the whole thing. You're just deploying a little chunk. So independent deployment is a really big benefit if you manage to do something like this. And autonomous teams. We have a client in Munich, a big financial institution, and I was talking with them, and they were telling me, yeah, we have like 1,000 developers working on this monolith, and you know what is our problem? And it's like, yes, I know. You are constantly stepping in each other's toes, because nobody can work on it. Maybe Google and Facebook can do it, but the rest of us cannot really work on code base and having a lot of people trying to get there without conflicts coming, merge conflicts, deployment. You have a test suite that has perhaps 5K tests. Maybe 50 of them are relevant to the thing that you are actually that you are trying to deploy right now. So that's the idea of getting this separation so that you as a team, which might be like a real agile team with 10 people max, can really get into that, can really get something out without having to get everybody involved. So that's more or less the why, the benefits, which we hope to convince you a bit. But before you even talk about like my frontends, you really have to ask yourself the question, do I need micro frontends? Just with any technology, do I need microservices? Do I need anything? It's a very sensible question to ask, because the answer is not always yes. In fact, in the I don't know if you're already familiar with this, if you follow Twitter, you might have seen not everybody in the community is a big fan of this thing. There are some pretty prominent people that don't get this thing. And when this article that I mentioned before was published, there was like a huge tweet wall or tweet storm of people like saying this all is basically bullshit. And I can understand to some extent, because I think you have to think in terms of trade-offs. I mean, we've been saying autonomy, maybe autonomy, right? We want to make teams a bit more separated. But that's not coming for free. That's something that's, I guess, the learning of this talk is this is not going to come for free. You are sacrificing other things, or you are making trade-offs there. If you want to do this, you are going to increase the complexity of the stuff you're building. Or maybe you're sacrificing the speed. In this case, speed means the speed of the website that you're delivering. We will see some actual examples of that. So for me, I tried to come up with some factors to consider, like, you know, some sort of very simple checklist. Should you actually do this, or is it really worth? And I think you have to ask yourself, like, are your teams verticals or horizontals? We tend to say this a lot, and I'm not sure if that's that clear, but for me, like, a vertical team is sort of a product team, a team that's cross-functional and organized along the lines of a product, where they can deliver along all the lines of this product independently. Whereas a horizontal product would be typical organization where you have all the front-end developers, they work together, all the back-end developers. Maybe you have people working on databases or infrastructure, and they constitute different groups. So every time you want to do something, you need to do your stuff and pass it to the other layer. If you're working in that fashion, it's going to be really hard to get any value out of microfrontends. It's not really, I wouldn't really recommend it. Again, priorities. I already said, if you really want to say, I want to get that fast time to I want to show something quickly to my users, that's good. But if your site has like a strong requirement in terms of UX consistency, if everything has to look the same, everything has to be consistent. If you're doing a bunch of microfrontends, everybody's working a bit on their own, that's really hard to manage. It might not be the right thing to do, like just to introduce something like this. And in terms of releases, comes to the tweet of, I think this is basically the tweet of Dan Abramov interpreted. If you're already really fast, if you're already delivering your software fast, maybe you don't need to make your life harder just to get a bit extra speed. This is really visible when you are, again, imagine this release per quarter. If you manage to get a release per week, it's a huge success. But if you're already doing a couple of hundred releases every day, then probably not. So that's what, yeah, all right. We talk about the what and the why. Maybe even scare some people, like, maybe this is not the right thing to try in my particular situation. But once you want to do it, you need to compose different front ends, right? This fancy chart I showed in the beginning. At the end, even though you are building a bunch of different applications, you need to make them fit into one unit, right? If you want to actually display that in one browser. So that's where we are going to focus on. We're going to show a bunch of different approaches. We tried to divide them a bit because we are two people, so we wanted, to have things to talk, both of us. So I'm kind of going to focus on the left side, sort of server side, and Matthias is going to talk in depth about the client side, more or less. There are a ton of ways of doing this, and the lines are definitely not as clear as this, so take that with a grain of salt. Let's start composing a bit of some microfrontends. So let's say build-time integration. What is that? That is, simply said, can be done by dividing the application into NPM packages. And then you deploy them as one entity. Again, nothing fancy. So say you have a website and you have some clear domains there, typical footer header, but some other parts. And you kind of split them in different applications that have, at the end, its own artifact, and its own bundle that you create. And then you put everything together through NPM and just ship it. It can be as easy as this. It can be, like a container kind of meta package that is just aggregating different other applications that are actually, well, your own microfrontends and that have their own life cycle, signified by the different versions there. In order to use this, you use React. Actually, it's, again, it might be something that you are doing already, so you can claim to do microfrontends, perhaps. You have like your page, and you have certain components that you're bringing from different packages, and you are integrating them through just something as simple as React Router. This seems simple, and it's actually something, you know, like, for instance, the last project I was on, we started actually as one team, so we didn't need any of this. So we started as one application, but then at some point, we needed to scale up the team. We needed to divide the team into different teams that would try to work a bit separately for each other. And we said, let's try to build this, you know, like different verticals with as little effort as possible. And we actually went for this approach. And it went pretty well, although it's fair to say that I was only there from the beginning because I actually left the project, and actually Matthias replaced me. So he can probably talk about the, you know, how this actually works in practice a lot better than I can. But that's the life of a consultant. So in terms of managing these packages, I mean, as I said, there are a few, you know, like, I don't know, if you have been in projects with a lot of NPM packages, you have to have some sort of way of dealing with this. And something like Lerna can be as little as needed. I see that we don't have we have people that are not fans. I can tell you, it really depends, right? What is your use case? For us, for example, in our project, we were a team that was collaborating very closely together. All the teams were sitting in the same room. And the idea of collaborating in one repo was doable. We also have seen people who try to make a mono repo work when they are not teams that work closely together, and that can blow up. So it's not a recommendation you do this without considering your context, but it's definitely something that is fairly easy to set up, right? You just need a bunch of packages, the setup, and you can actually get a lot out of this. Important part here is like the release independently. Like, I mean, you didn't like sort of split the whole monolith into packages to release them all like as one, you know, version, because then you're going back to a monolith just with more overhead. So in terms of pros and cons, something we're going to try to, you know, give an idea of what are the things that are good and bad. This one, it cannot get any simpler. I mean, the effort is low. And you actually don't really have any runtime impact because you're bundling your app anyhow, whatever the system is that you're using. So it ends up not really influencing anybody. The drawback of this approach is that, technically speaking, this is not a micro frontend. Because I was saying in the beginning, we have independent deployments, we have autonomy, and this is not really breaking that. Like, you're at the end, if you're building one package, everything is converging into one, like, whatever release pipeline is there. So you are not really breaking that. And if that link is not really, really fast, people are going to feel the pain. So the autonomy of the teams is not really guaranteed by this approach. I would say this is a good starting point, and it's one that is going to get, you're going to grow out of it sooner or later. That would be my guess. So that's one approach. Let's move to a second approach here. This is server-side includes. You might know it as well as edge-side includes if you have used Varnish. So what is a SSI? First of all, this is actually not anything new. And in fact, I think this precludes the idea of microfrontends by quite a bit. In any case, server-side include is kind of a scripting language where you can inject some sort of templates, some sort of files into your HTML page using directives. So let's have a look at one very simple example that can fit into one slide. This could be a page where you have some sort of belly HTML, and then you have this include directive, right? So how does that work? That's not, we're missing the part where that content gets filled. So in terms of configuration, if you have an Nginx, for example, it could be something like this. You're using a SSI module, and based on the route, you can inject certain content. In this case, each of those are just HTML pages that are available to this server. It could be that they are delivered, in the same folder where this runs, or it could be that they are URLs to your own micro frontend coming from a CDN, for example. Sounds simple. But I think a fair question to ask is like, where's the micro frontend? I don't see any micro frontends happening around here. So let's say I haven't second thoughts about this chart. I thought it was really clear the first time I drew it, but might not be. So let's try to explain it a bit. Basically, you have a page, and I say you have a bunch of these includes. Well, each include can bring anything. It can bring a full page that is including its own markup, its own styling, and its own JavaScript. So essentially, let's show a bit more of a more complex example. It could be, that you kind of split your base page into different components. And each of those is going to bring its own app to the table, so to say. So it could be something like this, like the page is basically separated in different entities. Each entity is its own complete application that can be delivered as one entity, which is now we are kind of fulfilling the definition of a micro frontend. So this is still simple. I mean, in the end, you are just like, have different web pages, and you are like putting them together. So you have an extra bit of infrastructure there, which is this Nginx or whatever else you use. But it's still like kind of, you see there is not, I as an owner of one of these micro frontends, don't really need to know a lot about the context that I'm on. I just need to know that I'm going to be injected into a page, maybe, like follow some conventions. But it's still simple enough. It does have a pretty big drawback, though. As I was saying, like every of these includes, it's bringing a web application on its own. Let's say we all want to use React. All of this might be bringing its own bundle there with React, with all the libraries, with the 500,000 NPM packages that you need to do a hello world in these days. So we are actually bringing a ton of assets, and we didn't even talk about like what happens to the CSS. I'm assuming let's assume we all use Bootstrap, and then we are loading like the same version of Bootstrap like 15 times. This is great in terms of developer's perspective, perfect. But I don't know, maybe you don't want to make your users use their full data plan every time they check your website on a mobile phone, right? It might be something you want to design for. So I'm going to direct you to this link if you want to learn more. We actually had a project in Munich that a few years ago that actually started down this path. They started with site includes. It's a pretty big site that actually has a lot of customers. And they had the problem that, well, this didn't really, you cannot really start a landing page for customers and do this these days. So they actually started with this, and they built their own framework based on site includes, and they started bringing a lot of complexity. And the result worked pretty well, but it was a lot, so they actually made a talk out of it. So it's actually a full talk, so you cannot really fit it in I don't know, the 5 minutes I should have left, give or take. So I'm going to swiftly jump out of it and make a small detour. I've been talking about composition, but that's not the only concern that you have, right? So every page that you are building today needs data. This data comes usually from a backend. That's pretty sensible. So how does this model work in combination with the typical ways of interacting with backends that you might have? It's even worse, because if you have a ton of micro frontends, and each of those has a lot of backend calls to make, you are actually scaling the problem, but in the bad way of scaling. So this is a pattern that I call it what to avoid. And actually, I got feedback from Matthias directly that the avoid part is a bit too strong. So let's say what to keep in mind. This is a pattern. In the end, you might land on something like this. You did all the micro frontend stuff. You went to all the hurdles. You have some microservices, and you put some sort of layer in between to coordinate the two of them. I think again, everything is trade-offs. But if you are going through all the trouble to separate everything and give all your teams the enablement that they can do their things on their own, And then you are putting some sort of gateway in the middle that is kind of aggregating everything and serving as a bottleneck, then why go through all this pain? So I think it's really dependent on what is actually a gateway for you. If a gateway is something that you can manage, like with a lot with, you know, like every team kind of injects themselves into that, something like RPG where things are more or less convenient, it works. But if the gateway is some sort of gateway where, you know, it's super hard to change, there's a team who controls everybody who goes through that, all that, you're basically building a monolith just in a different spot with twice the effort. So one concept we really like to give fancy names to things that are super obvious. So one is the backend for frontend. Who of you has heard backend for frontend before? Okay, that's good. Last time I asked, got even less hands. Again, I'm just putting fancy names on things that are relatively simple. It is custom backend for a particular client. What do I mean by that? You know, whenever you are writing web APIs in general, there is the approach of I'm going to make an API that will work for every use. So it's super generic. It kind of figures out every possible client will have a way of accessing this, proper REST design and so on. And then there is opposite approach of saying, we cannot predict how people are going to interact with our stuff, so why don't we build something that really fits our use case? In this case, a backend that is just thought for a particular client, which in the context of this talk is a microfrontend. So the idea is to build both of them together. It's what we have been doing in most of our projects. And I think the really important part is the last one is owned by the same team. In this case, you really are saying, all right, my frontend is going to communicate with an entity, and that entity is owned by us as well. If you delegate the ownership to somebody else, then the whole thing collapses. So I think it doesn't make a lot of sense to say that. So in terms of charts, you know, we have a bunch of microfrontends. And each of those communicate with their own backend for frontend, which is just a small app. It could be mostly a wrapper. It could be, you know, like there are no guidelines on what you want to put there. But the important part is the number of arrows. The number of arrows remains low. And they might need to check other services. You know, maybe you don't own the data that you need. You need to check with somebody else. Maybe you do. Doesn't really matter. Whoops. I did 12 months. There you go. So the important part, you talk to your own backend for frontend. And again, coupling, avoiding coupling. This actually, you know, like we had a project in Berlin for automotive again, where they built a huge app with a ton of microservices, with a ton of teams distributed across Germany and India. And they did all this, and then they realized after a couple of months that every micro frontend was sort of talking with everybody, and then they couldn't get anything out of the door, because every change required the interaction of multiple teams that were even in multiple time zones. So that's, I guess, something, you know, like a learning from our side to avoid. You don't, again, same idea over and over. You don't want to lose all the freedom that you got by going to an approach like this, by then binding everything together. So yeah, chatty applications. We'll get to the communication between micro frontends themselves. That is something that will make your life harder. It's something that you cannot really avoid. I mean, at the end, in order to be useful, you need to display data, and that data has to come from somewhere. So it's not like you can avoid it, but you can try to minimize it to make the pain a bit less. In fact, if you have this problem, it can be a sign that the domain boundaries are not really properly constructed. You know, like you have concepts and you're trying to aggregate things that actually belong together. Maybe they could be merged into something. In terms of CI/CD, you know, continuous delivery, of course, who doesn't do that? I actually have just 3 points. Smaller clients lead to smaller deployments. I think that's pretty much if I have to summarize this, talking one sentence is, if you do smaller things, it's going to be easier to manage them. So that's the benefit. And I have here a picture of one pipeline that we had in project I was on, where, again, it's just to show, like, you know, you have a very focused line, so to say, path to production, say, from left to right. It's really easy to visualize. It's really easy to debug. And it's really easy to take care of. That could be delivered to a CDN, to S3, to whatever. Doesn't really matter. If you want to get into build pipelines, it's another topic that actually takes its own talk. So I have another link in case you want to. I have an empty slide, which signifies I have to give up the mic.
Thank you very much. That was a very hard time for me because I think it was the first time I was not able to interrupt Mario for 30 minutes. Feels better already. Mario is coming from a back-end background. And what you could see from his presentation is that he's still pretty much in the back-end part, right? But what we have is actually something really powerful in the front end, which is a browser, right? Couldn't we use that? Couldn't we make up a really nice reason why we would not want to do all of that in the browser, in the face of the customer? Well, I want to start with a theory. And this theory is that not everything on a website can always be put behind a shared Nginx or Varnish or whatever, or can be done via server-side includes. And for this, I want to start with a few assumptions. The assumption one is there actually exists a setup where multiple teams create content for one website. Has anybody ever seen that? That multiple teams work on the same website? More than one team for one website? I see hands. Yeah, so it does exist. That's good. And the second one is there exists at least 2 teams in the world that don't share the same tool and infrastructure. Have you ever seen a team that uses a different tool or different infrastructure? Can you raise your hand if there was the case? Quite a few people. I would have expected more, to be honest. But my statement is the following. If those 2 assumptions are true, then there must be a number of websites, and this number has to be greater than 1, where the teams are actually not sharing the same tool or infrastructure. And I actually have a proof for that you can see on every website. And that's ads. Now, why do I come with ads? It's really down at the bottom. You might be able to see it if you just stand up a little. But it's not only ads, it's also Twitter widgets. It's the Google Maps that you can include in your website. This is not done via server-side includes. This is actually microfrontends in the browser, where the thing that you would see is only composited at that point where it's happening for the user. Now, the story about that is microfrontends in the browser are actually really, really old. I already gave you the example of the ads, and we can see them everywhere. This is one example of really, really good Knödel. In Kainer, if you're interested in Knödel or Tirol. And why do I know this is a microfrontend? Well, there's a very easy way to figure out what had been composited pretty late in the process. And that's opening the same website with a Wayback Machine. Because as this is not the same domain, the ad will not get loaded. Something that really only gets loaded once you open the website. But the thing is, microfrontends in the browser are actually even older than that. And one example for that are frames. This is a frame set. You might not have heard of it because it's really old and no longer supported in HTML5. But you might have heard of iframes, which are still around. Frames are a way to display different website context in specific boundaries on your website. Now, the thing about frames was that the idea wasn't all bad, but it had some drawbacks. Like, for instance, a frame set itself broke routing. If you would change the content of one of the frames, the URL would not be changed. So if you would send it around, people would not be able to open the same page that you saw. It broke the essence of the web. Now, with iframes, it got a little more convenient. With some workarounds, you could actually composite a little website that has, for instance, is a shopping website. It has a microfrontend with a shopping cart that would be displayed on every page. And based off the window location, you would just load different sources inside the iframe's content. With that, you can work around these routing restrictions to a certain part, And it would also help you working around other things. Now, this is really simple. It's probably frames and iframes are probably still the easiest way to do microfrontends. It's very isolated. So the things that are in an iframe stay in an iframe. If you have a style definition in there, it cannot get out, or not easily. But it's very hard to do this responsive. For instance, it can be done. I've seen people succeed in that, but it's really not the easiest thing that you want to do. Routing can still be tricky. Even if you have a solution like that, things like query strings or hashes that you have in URL might get lost and not be applied correctly. And most importantly, SEO is becoming interesting, because what you really have is a lot of URLs on your website. Now, Google might think that those are actually other websites, and then it starts indexing the things that are inside your iframe. And when people are searching for your website, they might end up there. You can break around this, again, via applying some logic, but it's probably something that you will forget, and then your SEO rating is going down. And I said, it's very isolated, which is maybe a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing, because it's hard to communicate between iframes. A workaround for that can be something like window.post message. And I'm going to take a little detour for that. Window.post message is a browser API that allows you to send messages to different sources, which are windows in the browser, based on origins, which are your URLs. Now, if you post a message like this, and you have someone who registered for a message as an event, they can check the source and the origin if they're really interested in this event, and in that case, handling them or just ignoring them. The very good thing about that is that it's actually immune to network lags. Now, the thing that we often forget about microservices is that a lot of the function calls that we had in a monolith, we are now doing over the network. And the network has one thing: it tends to be very unstable. This cannot happen if you only communicate in the browser. The thing can be made pretty secure. Well, it's still something that runs in a browser, so you can always assume that the user will be able to do things with it. But if you at least check for the source and the origin, you can at least verify who's actually calling you and not just trying to read every message that comes in. And the good thing is that, for instance, extensions for your browser would not be able to modify the source. It will always be set to null. It's also very lightweight, and it can help you think in events. This is something that can help you in the long run, because eventually, as your thing gets more and more complex, you might be thinking about something like, oh, Kafka is awesome, because everybody's talking about Kafka, so you want to have it too. But if you have started with an application that only does function calls, it's very hard to introduce something like that. If you have started by thinking in events, then this might actually be something that you can use to then just publish your events to a different endpoint, in that case, to a Kafka. But it comes with drawbacks. One of those is it actually needs a lot of extra love for you to support things like queuing. If we're talking about iframes, then those things are getting loaded asynchronous. You don't know exactly when the content would be there, and it's not easy to control it. So if you use messaging, you might need something to actually queue those messages, and when the iframe is there, you notify it. This is not given to you by the browser. You would have to implement it, and there comes complexity. Also, I've seen a lot of people using that, but actually not checking for source and targets. Now, the thing is, this is not only dangerous because more and more things are trying to send messages. Also, like for instance, a React extension is sending a lot of messages as soon as you open the developer studios. If you don't check for it, those messages might pollute your domain. And it's very hard to figure out what was going on. So if you're one of those persons that always forget validations, probably don't do that. And if you can't trust your user, you should really not solely rely on that. Now, if you have a shopping website and you push the product name and price into your shopping cart via this event, you can do that, but you probably want to do at the end, when you do your checkout, go to the product service again and ask for the real price, because it would be really easy for the user to just change that to something that's more convenient for the buyer. Now, the thing here is that, well, we have found a way to display things, the iframe, and we have made it kind of communicate. But there's the thing, iframes are iframes, right? They kind of feel 1999. We don't really want to use them. So what can we do to actually have something like iframe, but without iframes? And this is where module loading comes in. Now, module loading is actually already one of the most complicated things that you could do. So if you compare this in a chart, you can just work all on the same monorepo and have your code in there. It's super easy. Your code is, of course, not separated. You cannot separate your deployment, and you cannot control the go live of your little microfrontend. If you have NPM modules that you push to an Artifactory or to npm.com, then it's a little more difficult because you actually have to consider that you learn how to push your package once it's released. You have things like version management, which is always not as easy as it sounds in the first moment, but you're able to separate your code, and at least you, as a producer, are able to have your own separate deployment by pushing things to NPM. But it's actually really hard for you to control when your new version will be in a product, because you're dependent on them to roll it out. And this is where module loading comes in. It's the most difficult approaches of the ones that you can do, but you will have your separate code, you will have your separate deployment, and you will be able, when your microfrontend will actually show up in a browser. Now, why am I going into this version thing so much? Why is it not just okay to push it as an NPM module and let the frame that's displaying the website manage this version? Now, the thing is, and that's something that I already learned when I was doing backend development, that pinning the version for dependency is technical debt. It's really hard to manage versions correct. It's really hard to update all your dependencies all the time, to keep them secure, to keep them up to date. It's something that a lot of people don't really consider. It's a tech debt, and you should try to avoid it if you can. Now, one of the examples that I want to show you that does module loading and as such takes the heavy loading of versioning away from you is a single SPI. If you get into the acronym, it's really weird because it says single page application. But once you get around that, it's actually not so bad. For this to understand or to show you the benefits, I actually want to give a quick demo, which is always very dangerous because usually demos doesn't work. So I'll try my best and we see how well that actually goes. Now I have this folder here, right? And this folder has a few other folders, like the folder. There, almost there. Give me a second. That's why I don't do demos. There. Good enough. So that folder has a few subfolders, like the 1337, which coincidentally is also the port number. I might need a password there. Of the application once it's getting launched. This application is a Vue.js application. Vue.js is a front-end framework for those of you that don't know it. For those that are more comfortable with Angular or React, it's basically the same. The other application that we have in there, the 3000, is a React application. And so we have two very different applications in this folder. And we have also an application that's just called root. And it's really hard to see, maybe if I hit enter a few more times. There. And this application basically only has the index, a Docker file, and an nginx-conf. And what we are going to do is basically have this little application host the other two applications and include them at runtime. So I'm going to start all of that. The first one should be coming up pretty quickly. And it's not there yet. There. And it has different pages. It has a React page. Oh, it's already there. Damn, that was too quick. Where you can see the React application. So out of nothing, this React application was loaded in. And I can do the same for the Vue application. Look at that. There's a Vue application. But even more so, I can actually show both of them on one website. And they're just loaded as I would expect them to be loaded if I just would have a web component. Now the thing is, this thing was the index HTML that you can see there was started in a Docker container. I can no longer modify it without going into the Docker container. And I'm not planning to go into the Docker container. This is my Vue application. And if you look here, you can see there's a subheadline. So I'm going to change this thing to something. I'm not really creative, sorry for that. And I'm not going to start the index.html, but I'm rather just reloading the frame and zip, it's there. The whole application was deployed independently of the frame that was hosting it. And what's really happening is that the whole thing was basically just loaded in the browser and included. For that, I'm quickly going back to there's the presentation, and we're going to take a small deep dive into what is actually going on there. Now, single SPA allows you to register applications and use those applications as an import. With this, I basically told it that for specific locations, I want specific applications to be loaded. For instance, the React app and both of them for the 3000 and the Vue app and both app for the 1337. But how does all of that really works? How does it do at magic? And actually, that's nothing that single SPA has invented, but it's actually something that is a proposal by the W3C, and that's import maps. Import maps allow you, via a script tag on your website, to specify where a running website should get its imports from. Now, that's really something that can help you a lot, because you're no longer required to kind of webpack all of that together, but you can actually do that in the browser and then include it where you want it. So if we look at that on a picture, we have the index.html that you had in the Docker container. And we saw that we included a React and a single SPA dependency inside this index.html. And same as we did with them, we also included those two applications as dependencies. Now, what's even more powerful there is that the Vue application was self-contained. It had everything that it needed. But for the V3000, we actually did not include React. This was loaded inside the browser during runtime. So basically, the React version was given. If I have multiple React applications, I'm no longer required to ship all of them with React. But I could just give the React version into this deployable, thus keeping the load of the page much smaller. It would also allow me to just say, I'm not using the React version that you want me to use. I want to use the new one. So you already ship your application with the React dependency as a bundle with your application and say, I don't need React. Keep it away from me. I have my own React. As it's self-contained, it will still load. So you can have multiple React versions on one specific application, which is something that's usually really hard to achieve. Now, the thing that's even grander about that is that it's not only single SPA that's working on that, but there's actually a pull request open at Webpack since February, and I'm kind of waiting for it to get closed. And what Webpack will support then is all of that out of the box for your applications. So you basically can independently start to deploy your modules and just put them on as 3 buckets, and people can just import them in the browser and just compose it together. You're no longer required to learn all the documentation of single SPA, which is really a lot, But Webpack you're probably already using. So if you have the time, take a look at that merge request. It will probably change how we are working with microfrontends pretty soon. But that's not the only way you can do microfrontends in a browser. There's also something the W3C came up with quite some time ago. And that's web components. Who of you has heard about of that? Quite a few hands. Now, I'm always confused how many people have actually never heard about that. But it's something that is also really powerful. This is a quick example that shows you a web component that has a clock with a web component that has little digits down there that change. It's just a very artificial example to give you the rough idea. What you're doing is basically creating your own HTML elements, custom elements that have their own functionality and their own logic. There's one of those already in your browser. The video tag is a web component which has a lot of other elements in there, but via the methods that web components give you, you can extend the video element and put in your own components or your own functionality. Now, how does it look? This is the very simple example of an HTML element in the form of this clock digit. You have attributes that you can set. You have something like a life cycle that's similar to what you know from React. And most importantly, you have a way to define the name of your custom element. And here's this thing. As long as you haven't defined it, this thing does not exist in your browser. So if we look just at the HTML code and the script is not there, it will not display anything but the thing that's usually in there. Only when the web component is there and gets loaded and gets registered, then this web component would also be displayed on the page. So it's a very controlled and natural way to have your microfrontend inside a website. And it's kind of simple, not as simple as the other solutions that we saw, and it does not require you to use a library. It's browser native functionality, so it's pretty easy to get started. But you can also use libraries like Stencil.js that help you a little to get around the rough edges. It's as isolated as you need it to be. You can use additional functionality like shadow DOM or constructed style sheets to have things in there that are really more isolated from the surroundings and allow you to not influence the outside and not be influenced by the outside. And the browser support is getting stronger and stronger. If you only have your custom elements and the polyfill, you can even do it in Internet Explorer if you want. But if you looked at this little code example and you used, for instance, to a React 16 syntax, then it's pretty chatty and it's very class-based and it's kind of, it feels inflexible to what you are used to if you have worked in a more functional style with something like web components. And it has one downside, which is that tracking attributes can be really hard. In most languages, if you set an attribute from the outside, then it's kind of read-only. In web components, it's not. You can change it. But the thing is, it's not even propagated to the outside. So for the outside, it would be really hard to understand what's going on inside the web component, and thus can be super confusing. So if you're going to use them, do align that they are read-only, even if you can't change them, because otherwise, 2 months from now, somebody is going to come at you and scream. And they still feel pretty immature. There are not as many tools that can support you compared to something like Vue or React. Things that could really help you, like constructible style sheets or styling tweaks that allow you to have CSS selectors for your web components. They feel very hard to use, very hard to understand, or they're not widely supported. So you kind of made them work even in Internet Explorer, and then somebody comes and opens them in Safari, and all of it falls apart. But from the different micro-frontend approaches in a browser. One of the biggest pros that I've seen for that is that it's actually supported natively and is a standard that's supported by the browser. Web libraries come and go. This thing will probably stay as long as iframes. And iframes actually are not that bad.
I'm not sure I agree with the iframes part, though. So, yeah, we are almost in the end. And we hope that we gave you like an overview of what is actually, what you can expect from micro frontends. I think we have a funny picture here. Exactly. So I think there are some key, for me, there are some key learnings. One is like there is no other way. Like there are a ton of approaches. It really depends on what you want to do. There are a ton of libraries to do this. There are a ton of custom ways of doing this. We didn't even get into server-side rendering or things like that. We didn't mention half of what's out there. So it's a field where there's a ton of stuff, which means that there are different, different trade-offs being made. That's one part, right? You have options. The second part is you really have to ask yourself, why are we doing this? Is this actually that is helpful for us? Do we need it? Because it might be, it could easily be that you don't need to use micro frontends in your day-to-day. The pains, I think the way I see it is like, if you have felt the pains every day after day, like, all right, I cannot deploy this, I cannot do this, I'm sick of person X in team Y complaining about my styling, the way I indent my code in TypeScript. Those kind of issues, if you have felt them, I think then is when you say, right, why don't we try something else? I personally would not recommend doing this from scratch, although we have some people in our company that actually say you should start with this from the very beginning. I don't know. Everyone has an opinion, and I think that's pretty much the conclusion, right? It's just like microservices. It's a way of addressing. It's not just about technology. It's about how you organize the way you work with others and the way you collaborate, and it's something that you always need to make a decision for yourself based on the data you can use for your own case. So I think that's, there you go. That was somebody trying to deploy a micro frontend. That's pretty much it from our side. Thanks for listening, and we're more than happy to answer some questions if there are any.
Any questions in person? No? Okay. They are shy. So we have one question. What happens if different micro frontends have same dependencies? Is there already a framework that tries to recycle them, or will there be a lot of redundancy? I would say that's answered, right? SPA?
Yeah, single SPA is one of the examples, and also Webpack will be able to work on that and help you with sharing the same library or use different versions of the same library in case you need it.
Is that answered? Too anonymous? Okay. How do you test them?
The same way you test it, that's an easy answer, right? I think there are two aspects to it, right? The idea of breaking things apart means that you have hopefully contained flows that make sense on its own, that can be tested in the context of one micro frontend. But then I guess there is a component of multiple things interacting on a page, and then you say, all right, who owns that? Like, that's a typical question. I've seen that question pop up in our internal chats quite a bit. Like, if you're doing end-to-end tests and you're doing micro frontends, who is responsible if they break? So I think the answer is that there's not really an easy answer. As I said, they could, if you can, if the apps are sort of self-contained, then you have a clear boundary. Otherwise, you have to create the ownership of saying, well, like this is something that we all own together, and we need to test it maybe across boundaries, and it has to be like something like it's an end-to-end, and cover as little of the functionality as possible if you can. Because end-to-ends, whether you use micro frontends or anything or something else, tend to be flaky and tend to be hard to maintain. I've never seen an end-to-end setup that didn't have issues. Micro frontends, yes or no?
I haven't fully thought this through, but how does it affect security? If you have an enterprise application and that uses JWT tokens for backend calls, how is that affected if you have multiple microfrontends in your app and you need to make sure that they all use this, I don't know, the same or different tokens to talk, or the right token to talk to their specific backend or frontend, for example, and does that introduce potential security issues? Because
I think this. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
That sounds much. Okay. Anyway, so one thing that you would have in such a scenario is probably that you would also want to consider a single sign-on service that actually handles the authentication for you. You can't start doing microservices if you don't have a shared authentication. The second thing is that usually what you want to do is actually to avoid too chatty applications in the backend. I've worked on one project where we had this cascading thing that would go on, and also this cascading thing will basically go on in the context of the service. And what we had then a lot was, of course, privilege escalations, things that users were actually not allowed to do. So I would rather try to, if you're doing that, there are two things that are going weird. The one thing is that you probably haven't split your domain correct, your boundaries are leaky. You might have to include too many teams. And the other thing is that you should try to have as much as possible from a pure user perspective. There are things that, of course, run in the backend and that run asynchronously, but those are decoupled from the microfrontend. So you would solve it in the same way as you would try to solve them in a microservice environment by authenticating in the name of a user, for instance, via API tokens. The other thing is never trust something that happens in the browser, right? Yeah, it's as simple as that. You can use it to make it more convenient for users to see something popping up immediately. If you're clicking on add a product, you want to see it in the shopping cart right away. You don't want to click on it and then nothing pops up. So that's the right amount of communication that you want to have in the browser. You still want to have the backend communication to actually make sure that you have something transactional and verified and authenticated and authorized. I hope that answers it a little.
I have written this on Slido as well, but I have to ask it because I have to leave in a minute, and I want an answer on that. You talked about S3 buckets, and I asked that before. The general question is, what is the best way to host microfront and the best way to host it? So you're talking about S3, so we're talking about a kind of a serverless approach. How can I imagine how this works maybe from a retrospective or from a CI/CD perspective? How do I deploy it to the different buckets, and how does my front end then knows which bucket it needs to address for which component?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in terms of front end, for me, at this point, I would say go with the simplest approach that works. So I would say usually what tends to work well is you build your front end as an artifact, and you put it in an S3 bucket, maybe with CloudFront on top. And depending on what you are using there, I mean, if you are using domains to separate them, then you can just say, well, every front end is hosted under a different domain. And so you have that, right? So you have the front end hosted there, and you can, like, your pipeline is basically getting a new version into what's essentially a CDN. And then for the part, like, that's all right, live example.
So you have a separate pipeline for every component, is that correct?
I mean, for me, I would say I would have a separate pipeline for every micro frontend. Like, we didn't go into that, but if, I mean, at the end, micro frontends tend to be coupled with some sort of backend. But I am a fan of deploying them separately. You know, like a pipeline that is front-end specific. At the end, the observable result of that would be a bucket or a CDN or something, even something behind an Nginx being uploaded anew with the new, you know, the new versions and new assets. And this is an example, I guess.
Yeah, I wanted to give you a quick example how this can be done on a live website. If you look on ThoughtWorks.com, you can see that this is one of our customers. And this is one of the examples that I can give where we actually have something like that. I changed the network speed to slow 3G, so the website is not really that slow as it looks right now. But if I start a search here, we can see that actually a lot of things are going on. There are a lot of chunks being loaded at a specific point in time. And the information that is most important will be there from the beginning, whereas the rest would be loaded once it's the script's time to be loaded. Now, how is that actually orchestrated? Very simple. It's just always put on the same bucket. So whenever you deploy a new version, it will actually have the same bucket, the same file, and it would update immediately. So if that thing that was shown last would be deployed, let's say with a different icon, then it would immediately change for the next user because it's already there. So this does not change. You configure it once, but then each of those teams, this team that does the leasing calculation, this team that does the pricing, they all deploy independently, and their changes would be visible when they're there. You can still cache the script. You can add, for instance, caching tags if you want, or you just set the cache header. I think the cache headers there are set to, I don't know, kind of short time, so the changes pop up pretty quick. Also because with those things, there are a lot of legal things that you have to make sure happen immediately. So I think those have like a time to live of a few seconds. But yes, it restricts caching if you have something like that, but the shared scripts, for instance, this is a React application and not all of those components deliver their own React. The React part is cached, so that you don't have to load.
Thank you. What's the monthly rate for this part?
The question was, what was the monthly rate? Well, it's actually pretty affordable. Maybe I stop with a slow 3G. So you can have it as a rate with 60,500 euro. If you start by paying 200,000 euro in advance.
So here's another question.
So my question would be, how do you share state between the components? For instance, the name of the currently logged in user, you want to greet him with hello, Thomas. I can imagine that there are different possibilities when you use iframes or as a single SPA because of the isolation also.
So we have had some approaches to that, and again, like the easy answer and the non-answer is don't share if you can. But if you still want to share, I mean, with iframes, you are going to build this kind of event bus kind of stuff where people are listening to certain messages and you are broadcasting them over the browser. And if you are using something more integrated, something that some of our projects have tried is using Redux for that. Like you have a Redux that is a store that is like there is a container, like the container that renders everybody else builds a Redux store that is available for everybody, and every microfrontend has a namespace for it. And then you can sort of use that to share. But the experience is that you really have to have a strong governance in a sense. I mean, at the end, it's the exact same thing as how do you share a database if you're doing microservices? If you're doing it, it might work, but it's really easy to fall into a trap where everybody's coupled together. So I think that's, I mean, learning is try to avoid it as much. I have like very clear rules, what goes there and what are the sort of, what can we put there and what do we expect to happen when we change something there, would be my answer.
What do you recommend when you already have a huge monolithic front end in Angular? what would be the first steps to turn it to micro frontend?
A good thing to find to start with that is usually identify a small thing on your website that is more independent of the rest than the others. So just as we saw there, like the leasing calculator, which was pretty independent of the rest, there are usually functionalities on your website that are not so much coupled into the rest. You start to try out the approach if it actually suits you. So take this little slice that's not as important to everybody or that's pretty independent of the rest of it and just try how well it goes. If that works well, you have learned already quite a bit and you can apply this learning to the more complicated parts of your application and then slice it and dice it as you feel it makes sense. Do something like event storming, where you actually start to identifying the events that flow through your application and where splits make sense. Where's your aggregate root? What are the entities and value objects that are floating around in your SPI? And how are they dependent on each other? And where you find boundaries, those are your natural next slides. Don't try to make it too small though, because if you really start making like nano frontends would have been enough, nano frontends, then you will be it will be really hard for you because things will have to be shared between those different nano things. Try to create a wide side services in your front end and not just doing small because small is cool.
So no header micro frontend.
Well, a header front end is actually something that's pretty independent of the rest of the page, isn't it? It has some information about route, but actually it's the only page that has to know it. So it might be a good example of something that you can try to do first, and would also allow you that whenever your company comes up with a new logo, it's pretty easy to stay. You don't have to tell everybody to update the icon.
Cool. You said backend for frontend. So I would create a small frontend and the backend or the API it needs, right? Will GraphQL make any sense in that way? Because it's a small backend, right?
I guess, but it's, I don't know. It's a hot topic for us because on one hand, it's like, all right, you are making exactly the calls that you need in order to build the graph of information that your client needs. On the other hand, it's really easy to slip into, you have one huge point of control where everything is controlled and you have to go through there. So I think whether you use GraphQL or not, the point is trying, like, that sort of not having an entity that is having the sole ownership of the whole thing. And if you have that, giving the teams that are working on it the possibility to insert themselves into that. I mean, actually, I used to work for Xing before, as the German LinkedIn, as we like to call it. And we actually, I think, has been published. They have held topics about how they migrated their API gateway to GraphQL. And I can tell you I was there when that was happening, and I didn't like it one bit. I felt like all the technology in the world cannot fix a process that is fucked up, I would say.
Okay. Why learner?
It's there.
Okay.
If you like Yarn. I mean, again, I would say, like, if you have 15 teams working on this, like, like you have a big portfolio and there's a lot of people building stuff, that is not going to work. But if you have 3 teams and you don't really want people to check out 5 repositories every time they want to do something, it can be useful, like, I don't know, like, what's your experience with Lerna?
So the team that we're currently in, we're using Yarn workspaces and Learner. Actually, is the first approach to separate those things. The idea is that eventually we will be able to get into maybe different approaches, like doing that in a browser, but it gives you a decent start and it helps you with some things that you would have to set up, like, for instance, publishing them to an artifactory that are otherwise not as easy to accomplish. So it gives you some of that heavy lifting that otherwise you would have to do on your own. And I actually don't want to write such things. I want to write the software that's delivered to the user. So whatever can help me, I would use. I guess the question came in that direction. Do you want to add something?
More questions. Why didn't you include Angular? Any specific reason? Yes or no, maybe.
I personally, I mean, it's a personal opinion. I dislike Angular. I don't, I mean, again, opinions are free, right? I haven't had good experiences with Angular. I'm more of a React person. But all in all, like you can do code splitting. Like all in all, you can do Angular as well. But if you check, like like the community and then the drive, at least for our own case, the projects that we have at ThoughtWorks in Germany, we tend to gravitate towards React. It's maybe like bias, but it's the thing that we know, and that's we are more comfortable talking about React than about Angular.
Maybe the one thing that would speak for Angular is that it now has native support for web components as well. So you can kind of deploy the Angular application as a web component and then use it in other applications. Why I did not include it in the single SPA, but used Vue, was because I was actually not able to make it work. And Vue was quicker.
What's the difference between custom elements and web components?
Well, custom elements are web components. The web components also include other things that you can use, like Shadow DOM or constructed style sheets, and custom elements are part of that. So web components are like the big word for the collection of all of those things that you can use.
So if you've talked about autonomous teams as well. So if in a company you have multiple teams which are working on different products, and they should be free to choose the technology of their choosing, for example, React or Angular, how would you accomplish something like shared components which are agnostic of the technology that are used? For example, something like an authentication framework, which should be used the same way across the entire field. Is there something that, I mean, web components comes close, but something like web interceptors, things like that, is there some one-size-fits-all solution, or is there?
I don't think there's one solution, but we had that experience in the client we just mentioned before. And we had, I mean, we didn't have Vue, but we had a pretty big camp of Angular and React. And we started with pure vanilla JavaScript stuff to share like headers and footers and these kind of things. And the good thing was that everybody hated it equally, so it was inclusive in that sense. But the second approach was actually Stencil.js. Like the idea was that web components could provide this basis that could be integrated relatively easily by people who were doing Angular, people who were doing React, and people who were doing like straight like vanilla JavaScript because they didn't need something else. So that was our test, and I think they were decently happy with it. I mean, I was not involved in that team in particular, but it seemed to me that it worked well enough.
So web components.
I mean, Stencil.js actually can compile to web components, Angular and React, so it's kind of a lot of, I mean, kind of a layer on top of web components if you want. So yeah, web components for me would be.
What was the first?
Stencil.js. Stencil, like STEN.
Oh, okay.
Like 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 something you.
Yeah. Got it. Thank you. No.
So the last question in Slido was, will you share your slides? Probably. Right?
Yeah, sure.
One beer for each of you, and we get the slides. Cool.
We are easy like that. I have a question of my own before we get. What's going on with that camera? It's a I keep seeing you doing that, and have a hard time not laughing.
The presentation is actually already on GitHub, on his space, so we're just going to share that afterwards, so that you can get it on the website, and then you can run it locally on your machine.
Or as PDF.
And as PDF as well, yes.
Yes, we will put it on the Lateboards page. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
So they will stick around a little bit more minutes. We can have some drinks, talk. So thank you again. We have some sponsors today. Guevara, who has delivered a lemonade from Bali. It tastes really good. And Y-Food. So if you are a little bit hungry, we don't have real food today, but drinking food. You can try that. And also Ratisbona Coding e.V. has sponsored us. And they will also announce a new event.
Don't worry, it won't take too long, and I don't want to sell you something. So my name is Robert, and this is Konstantin. We are both in charge of the Ratisbona coding, and what we want to do is just tell you something about the idea behind our club. Yeah.
So we are a student-run organization based here in Regensburg. You may have heard of the Hackerburg Hackathon, which is taking place every year here at TechBase. We basically organize that together with the DGO and the TechBase stuff. And our organization's aim is to bring together the IT crowd here in Regensburg. And when we heard about 8Select doing these kind of talks, we know from experience how hard it is to organize those talks. We know that it might be a little bit difficult, like even if you're a corporation financially speaking. So we were really happy to sponsor this event today. We're actually really happy that a lot of you guys and girls came tonight. We hope that you as 8Select do more of these talks, because it was super interesting, thanks to you guys. And I mean, basically that's all. Currently, if you're interested, the applications for Hackerburg and all the marketing stuff will start soon. I hope that the coronavirus doesn't interfere too much with that. It's a hot topic right now, but we are pretty confident that it hopefully won't affect us that much. And yeah, that's basically it. Nice. Yeah.
So we just want you to invite to talk with us, just if you have some ideas how you can bring IT to the community. We are nerds here, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But maybe you know some people who are just starting to get to IT and they are not so confident about this. Just come to us, maybe we can help you if you have any ideas. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So stick around, talk to each other, and have fun, and see you next time. Thank you.